121. Not to break any of the bones of the paschal sacrifice, as Exodus 12:46 states, neither shall you break a bone of it. 122. Not to break any of the bones of the second paschal sacrifice, as Numbers 9:12 states, neither shall you break a bone of it. 123. Not to remove the meat of the paschal sacrifice from the company in which it is being eaten, as Exodus 12:46 states, do not remove any of the meat from the house. 124. Not to allow any of the remaining portions of the meal offerings to leaven, as Leviticus 6:10 states, it shall not be baked as leaven. Their portion, or 125, not to eat the meat of the paschal sacrifice raw or boiled in water, as Exodus 12:9 states, do not eat from it raw or boiled in water. 126. Not to feed the meat of the paschal sacrifice to a resident alien, as Exodus 12:45 states, no temporary resident or hired worker may eat from it. 127. Not to feed the meat of the paschal sacrifice to an uncircumcised male, as Exodus 12:48 states, no uncircumcised person may eat of it. 128. Not to feed the meat of the paschal sacrifice to an apostate Jew, as Exodus 12:43 states, no outsider may eat from it. This refers to a Jew who has become assimilated among the Gentiles and serves false gods as they do. He must not partake of the paschal sacrifice. 129. For a person who became ritually impure, not to partake of consecrated foods, as Leviticus 6:20 states, and a soul who partakes of the meat of the peace sacrifice while he is impure. 130. Not to partake of consecrated foods that have contracted ritual impurity, as Leviticus 7:19 states, meat that has touched any impurity shall not be eaten. 131. Not to eat sacrificial meat that has remained past the limits allotted for its consumption, as Leviticus 19:8 states, one who eats it shall bear his guilt. His soul will be punished by karet. 132. Not to eat pig gall, as Leviticus 7:18 states, it will not be accepted for him. Instead, it will be considered as pig gall. Any person who eats it will bear his guilt. This sin is punishable by karet. 133. For an unauthorized person not to partake of the terumat, too, as Leviticus 22:10 states, no unauthorized person shall eat it. 134. For even a tenant or a hired worker employed by a priest not to partake of teruma, as Leviticus 22:10 states, a tenant of a priest or his hired worker shall not eat the holy food. 135. For an uncircumcised person not to partake of teruma or other consecrated foods. This concept was derived from a Gezer Shava 3 and is not explicitly mentioned in the Torah. Nevertheless, based on the oral tradition, the prohibition against an uncircumcised person partaking of consecrated foods is considered as a prohibition of the Torah itself and not a decree of the sages. 136. For a priest who is impure not to partake of teruma, as Leviticus 22:4 states, any of your descendants shall not eat from the consecrated foods. 137. For a kalala not to partake of consecrated foods, neither teruma nor the breast and the shank bone given to the priest, as Leviticus 22:12 states, when a priest's daughter marries an unauthorized person, she shall not eat from the sacred elevated gifts. 138. For a meal offering brought by a priest not to be eaten, as Leviticus 6:15 states, any meal offering brought by a priest shall be consumed entirely by fire. It shall not be eaten. 139. Not to partake of the meat of the sin offerings whose blood is sprinkled within the temple sanctuary, as Leviticus 6:23 states. Any sin offering whose blood has been brought. Why? 140. Not to partake of consecrated animals that were disqualified for use as sacrifices because a blemish was intentionally inflicted upon them, as Deuteronomy 14:3 states, do not eat of any abomination. According to the oral tradition, we have learned that the verse refers to consecrated animals that were disqualified for use because of a blemish inflicted upon them. 141. Not to eat grain separated as the second tithe outside of Jerusalem, as Deuteronomy 12 verse 17 states. You may not eat within your gates the tithe from your grain. 142. Not to consume wine separated as the second tithe outside Jerusalem, as Deuteronomy opsati continues, your wine. 143. Not to consume oil separated as the second tithe outside Jerusalem, as Deuteronomy opsitit continues, and your oil. 144. Not to eat an unblemished firstling animal outside Jerusalem, as Deuteronomy opsit states, you may not eat within your gates, and the firstlings of your cattle and flocks. 145. For the priests not to eat a sin offering or a guilt offering outside the temple courtyard, as Deuteronomy opsit continues, your cattle and your flocks. According to the oral tradition, the purpose of this phrase is only to forbid the consumption of the sin offerings and the guilt offerings outside the temple courtyard. Anything that is eaten outside the place intended for it is covered by the prohibition. You may not eat within your gates. 146. Not to eat the meat of a burnt offering, as Deuteronomy opsit states, you may not eat the sacrifices you have vowed to bring, meaning to say, you may not partake of the sacrifices you have vowed to give. This is a warning against a person's benefiting from the unauthorized use of consecrated articles which he is forbidden to use. If he derives such benefit, he transgresses. 147. Not to eat the meat of sacrifices of a lesser order of holiness before the sprinkling of their blood, as Deuteronomy opsitation states, you may not eat the animals you have pledged to bring as sacrifices, i.e., you are not allowed to eat from the sacrifices you have pledged until their blood has been sprinkled. 148. For an unauthorized person not to eat the meat of the sacrifices of the highest order of sanctity, as Exodus 29:33 states, an unauthorized person shall not partake of them, for they are holy. 149. For a priest not to partake of the first fruits, bikurim, before they are placed down in the temple courtyard, as Deuteronomy opsit states, you may not eat the elevated gifts delivered by hand. The latter phrase refers to the first fruits. 15. Not to eat the second tithe, which has become impure, even within Jerusalem, until it has been redeemed. As Deuteronomy 26:14 states, I have not consumed it while it is impure. 151. Not to eat the second tithe while in mourning, as Deuteronomy opsit states, I have not eaten from it while in mourning. 152. Not to use the proceeds from the redemption of the second tithe for anything aside from food and drink, as Deuteronomy opsit states, I have not used it for the dead. Anything that is not associated with the needs of a living body is referred to as used for the dead. 153. Not to eat tevel. Tevel refers to produce from which one is obligated to separate teruma and tithes from which God's teruma has not been separated, as Leviticus 22:15 states, and they shall not profane the sacred gifts which the children of Israel will separate for God. This implies that the produce which the Jews will ultimately separate for God should not be treated in a mundane manner and eaten while tevel. 154. Not to separate teruma before the first fruits, nor the first tithe before teruma, nor the second tithe before the first. Rather, the agricultural gifts must be given in order. First, the first fruits, afterwards teruma, afterwards the first tithe, and afterwards the second tithe. As implied by Exodus 22:28, do not delay your offerings of newly ripened produce and your agricultural offerings. This means, do not delay bringing an offering that should be brought first. 155. Not to delay bringing sacrifices you have vowed to offer, or animals which you have pledged to bring as sacrifices, as Deuteronomy 23:22 states. When you make a pledge to God, do not delay paying it. 156. Not to make a festive pilgrimage without bringing a sacrifice, as Exodus 23:15 states. Do not appear before me empty-handed. 157. Not to violate a vow which a person makes forbidding his use of anything, as Numbers 33 states. He shall not violate his word. 158. For a priest not to marry an immoral woman Zona, as Leviticus 21:7 states, they shall not marry an immoral woman or a halala. 159. For a priest not to marry a chalala, for as Leviticus 21:7 states, they shall not marry a chalala. 160. For a priest not to marry a divorcee, as Leviticus 21:7 states, nor may they marry a woman divorced from her husband. 161. For a high priest not to marry a widow, as Leviticus 21:14 states, a widow, a divorcee, a chalala, or an immoral woman, these he must not marry. 162. For a high priest not to have sexual relations with a widow, even outside the context of marriage, because by doing so he profanes her, as Leviticus 21:15 states, he shall not profane his progeny. This also implies that he must not cause a woman eligible to marry a priest to become ineligible, as happens through the relations described above. 163. For a priest not to enter the temple with hair that has grown unseemingly long, as implied by Leviticus 10:6, do not let your hair grow long. 164. For a priest not to enter the temple with torn garments, as implied by Leviticus opposite. For a priest not to leave the temple courtyard in the midst of service, as implied by Leviticus 10:7, do not depart from before the entrance to the tent of testimony. For a common priest not to become impure through contact with a corpse, with the exception of the specific instances permitted by the Torah, as Leviticus 21:1 states, he shall not become impure through contact with the dead. 167. For a high priest not to become impure through contact with any corpse, even those of his relatives, as Leviticus 21:11 states, he shall not become impure even for his father and mother. 168. For a high priest not to enter the place where a corpse is found, as Leviticus 21:11 states, he should not come in contact with any dead body. According to the oral tradition, we have learned that he is obligated, for violating both the prohibitions, not to become impure and not to enter the place of a corpse. 169. For the tribe of Levi not to take a portion of Eretz Yisrael, as Deuteronomy 18:2 states, he shall not receive an inheritance. For the tribe of Levi not to take a portion of the spoils in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, as Deuteronomy 18:1 states, the priests and the Levites shall not receive a portion or an inheritance. Not to tear out hair in mourning for the dead, as Deuteronomy 14:1 states, do not make a bald spot upon your heads. 172. Not to eat non-kosher animals, as Deuteronomy 14:7 states, nevertheless, among those who chew the cud, these you may not eat. 173. Not to eat non-kosher fish, as Leviticus 11:11 states, they shall be regarded as a detestable thing for you. Do not partake of their flesh. 174. Not to eat non-kosher birds, as Leviticus 11:13 states, these birds you must regard as detestable. Do not partake of them. 175. Not to eat flying insects, as Deuteronomy 14:19 states, every flying insect that is not kosher for you shall not be eaten. 176. Not to eat insects that breed on land, as Leviticus 11:41 states, every insect that creeps upon the earth must be regarded as detestable. It may not be eaten. 177. Not to eat anything that creeps on the earth, as Leviticus 11:44 states, do not make your souls impure with any insect that creeps upon the earth. 178. Not to eat worms that breed in produce after they become exposed to the air, as Leviticus 11:42 states, for any swarming creature which breeds upon the land, you shall not eat them. 179. Not to eat swarming creatures that breed in the water, as Leviticus 11:43 states, do not make yourselves detestable by eating any swarming creature. 180. Not to eat carrion, as Deuteronomy 14:21 states. Do not eat carrion. 181. Not to eat an animal with a mortal infliction, treifa, as Exodus 22:30 states. Do not eat flesh torn off by a predator. 182. Not to eat a limb from a living animal, as Deuteronomy 12:23 states. Do not eat the life of an animal with its flesh. 183. Not to eat the displaced sciatic nerve, as Genesis 32:33 states. Therefore the children of Israel do not eat the displaced nerve. 184. Not to consume blood, as Leviticus 7:26 states. Do not consume any blood. 185. Not to partake of hard fat, as Leviticus 7:23 states. Do not eat any of the fat in an ox, sheep, or goat. 186. Not to cook meat and milk together, as Exodus 23:19 states. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. 187. Not to eat meat and milk together, as Exodus 34:26 states. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Based on the oral tradition, we have learned that one of these verses implies a prohibition against cooking the two together, and the other a prohibition against eating from the combination. 188. Not to partake of the meat of an ox that was stoned to death, as Exodus 21:28 states, and do not eat its flesh. 189. Not to eat bread made from newly grown produce before Pesach, as Leviticus 23:14 states. Until that day, you may not eat bread. 190. Not to eat roasted grain from newly grown produce before Pesach, as Leviticus Opsidit continues. Until that day, you may not eat roasted grain. 191. Not to eat fresh grain from newly grown produce before Pesach, as Leviticus Opsit continues. Until that day, you may not eat fresh grain. 192. Not to eat orla for 3 years, as Leviticus 19:23 states. For 3 years, you must regard its fruit as a forbidden growth. It may not be eaten. 193. Not to eat mixed species planted in a vineyard, as Deuteronomy 22:9 states, quote, lest the yield of the crops you planted and the fruit of the vineyard shall become forfeit. This refers to a prohibition against eating such produce. 194. Not to drink wine used for idolatrous libations, as Deuteronomy 32:38 states, quote, who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their libations. 195. Not to eat or drink like a glutton and a drunkard, as Deuteronomy 21:20 states. This son of ours is a glutton and a drunkard. 196. Not to eat on the day of the fast of Yom Kippur, as Leviticus 23:29 states. For any person who does not afflict himself on that day. 197. Not to partake of chametz on Pesach, as Exodus 13:3 states. Do not eat chametz. 198. Not to eat a mixture of chametz, as Exodus 12:20 states. Do not eat any leavened matter. 199. Not to eat chametz after noontime on the 14th of Nisan, as Deuteronomy 16:3 states. Do not eat chametz with it. 200. Not to have chametz seen in one's possession during Pesach, as Exodus 13:7 states. No chametz and no leaven may be seen in your territories. 201. Not to have chametz found in one's possession during Pesach, as Exodus 13:7 states. No chametz may be found in your homes. Or a Nazirite, not to drink wine or partake of anything in which wine was mixed and has the taste of wine, as Numbers 6:3 states. He shall not drink any grape beverage. This prohibition applies even if the wine or other beverage with which the wine was mixed has become sour, as the above verse states. He may not drink vinegar from wine or wine brandy. 203. For a Nazirite not to eat fresh grapes, as Numbers Opsitic states. He shall not eat fresh grapes. 204. For a Nazirite not to eat raisins, as Numbers Opsitic states. He shall not eat dried grapes. 205. For a Nazirite not to eat grape seeds, as Numbers 6:4 states. He shall not eat anything from wine grapes from its seeds. 206. For a Nazirite not to eat grape peels, as Numbers Opsiti continues. he shall not eat anything from wine grapes to its peels. 207. For a Nazirite not to become impure through contact with a dead body, as Numbers 6:7 states, he may not become impure even for his father, his mother. And 208. For a Nazirite not to enter below any roof beneath which a corpse is found, as Leviticus 21:11 states, he shall not come into contact with any dead body. 209. For a Nazirite not to shave, as Numbers 6:5 states, a razor shall not pass upon his head. 210. Not to harvest one's entire field, as Leviticus 23:22 states, do not completely harvest the ends of your fields. 211. Not to gather the individual stalks that fall in the harvest, as Leviticus opposite text states, do not gather the leket of your harvest. 212. Not to harvest underdeveloped grape clusters, as Leviticus 19:10 states, do not pick the incompletely formed grape clusters in your vineyard. 213. Not to gather individual fallen grapes, as Leviticus opposite it states, do not gather the individual fallen grapes in your vineyard. 214. Not to take a sheaf which has been forgotten, as Deuteronomy 24:19 states, do not go back to take it. This prohibition also applies to all trees, Asap 24:20 states, do not carefully reharvest it. 215. Not to sow mixed species of seeds together, as Leviticus 19:19 states, do not sow different species of seed in your field. 216. Not to sow grain or vegetables in a vineyard, as Deuteronomy 22:9 states, do not plant different species in your vineyard. 217. Not to crossbreed different species of animals, as Leviticus 19:19 states, do not crossbreed your livestock with other species. 218. Not to work with two different species of animals together, as Deuteronomy 22:10 states, do not plow with an ox and a donkey together. 219. Not to muzzle an ox while it is working with produce from which it would eat and derive benefit, as Deuteronomy 25:4 states, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading grain. 220. Not to cultivate the land in the 7th year, as Leviticus 25:4 states, do not sow your field. 221. Not to cultivate trees in the 7th year, as Leviticus opposite it continues, do not prune your vineyard. 222. Not to reap crops that grow on their own in the 7th year, in the same manner as in an ordinary year, as Leviticus 25:5 states, do not reap the crops of your harvest that grow on their own. 223. Not to reap fruit that grows on trees in the 7th year in the same manner as in an ordinary year, as Leviticus opposite continues, and do not gather the grapes of your vines from which you must abstain. 272. Not to do agricultural work, whether with land or trees, in the Jubilee year, as Leviticus 25:11 states, do not sow what? 225. Not to reap crops that grow on their own in the Jubilee year in the same manner as in an ordinary year, as Leviticus opposite states, do not harvest the crops which grow on their own. 226. Not to reap the fruit of the Jubilee year in the same manner as in an ordinary year, as Leviticus Opus CTI continues, and do not gather the grapes of your vines from which you must abstain. 227. Not to sell a field in Eretz Yisrael in perpetuity, as Leviticus 25:23 states. Do not make a permanent sale of the land. 228. Not to change the purpose of the open areas and fields granted to the Levites, as Leviticus 25:34 states. The fields of the open areas surrounding their cities shall not be sold. According to the oral tradition, we have learned that this verse is a prohibition against changing the purpose for which these lands are used. 229. Not to forsake the Levites, as Deuteronomy 12:191 states. Be very careful not to abandon the Levite. Rather, we must give them the portions they are due and rejoice with them on each of the festivals. 230. Not to demand the repayment of a loan after the 7th year has passed, as Deuteronomy 15:2 states, do not demand payment from your fellow man. 231. Not to withhold lending money to a poor person because of the advent of the Shemitah year, as Deuteronomy 15:9 states. Be careful, lest an idea occur to you. This is an accepted general principle. Whenever the Torah uses the expressions be careful, lest, or do not, a negative commandment is involved. 232. Not to withhold lending money to a poor person or providing him with his needs, as Deuteronomy 15:7 states. Do not harden your heart. Thus, a person who gives charity fulfills a positive commandment, while one who spurns the opportunity to give not only fails to perform a positive commandment, but also transgresses a negative commandment. 233. Not to send away a Hebrew servant empty-handed when he goes free, as Deuteronomy 15:13 states. Do not send him away empty-handed. 234. Not to demand payment of a debt from a poor person when one knows that he is impoverished, nor to cause him grief, as Exodus 22:24 states. Do not behave like a creditor towards him. 235. Not to lend at interest to a Jew, as Leviticus 25:37 states. Do not lend him your money at interest. 236. Not to borrow with interest, as inferred from Deuteronomy 23:20, which states, do not take interest from your brother. According to the oral tradition, this verse is interpreted as a prohibition, forbidding a borrower from paying interest to a lender. 237. Not to intermediate between the borrower and lender when interest is involved, nor to act as a guarantor or a witness to such a loan, nor to draw up a contract for it, as Exodus 22:24 states. Do not charge him interest. 238. Not to delay payment of a worker, as Leviticus 19:13 states. Do not hold back a worker's wages overnight. 239. Not to take security from a debtor by force, as Deuteronomy 24:10 states. Do not enter his home to take security. 240. Not to withhold the return of security to its owner when he needs it, as Deuteronomy 24:12 states. Do not lie down to sleep with his security, i.e., do not lie down while holding his security. Instead, return it to him at night when he needs it at night.